Hi, I'm Jason Evans,
And I'm Phil Bouchard.
and we're with the Shadow Mountain Bike Park.
We are the Shadow Mountain Bike Park.
We are the Shadow Mountain Park.
For now.
For now, yes. It's a small team, but it's a growing team. But if you're not familiar with us, we are the two folks who started the project 4 years ago and are continuing to work on it today and are hopefully close to bringing it to fruition.
We recently heard you all on Conifer Radio, where you were talking about the Shadow Mountain Bike Park development that you have been working on for 4 years. So I wanted to find out from you more about why you're doing this, why this land, why here in Conifer, why this community.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we'll try to do it in a relatively short answer, but the origin of the project is actually very simple and very innocent. So Jason and I have career mountain bikers, right? Obviously we didn't go pro or we wouldn't be opening our own park, but we started riding when we were kids. You guys might know, we met in middle school and there's a whole saga to that, but we've been riding our whole lives. We ended up in Colorado at about the same time and started riding everything that was available to us here, and we felt like for a variety of reasons there was a missing piece. And probably the simplest way to describe it is dedicated infrastructure for mountain bikers. And there's a lot of reasons why we think that would add value to the Conifer area and to this region more generally. But probably the most simple and basic one is that public trails are overcrowded. And I think anybody who is a user of public trails, whether you're a mountain biker or you subscribe to a different discipline like hiking or dog walking or bird watching, or you're an equestrian or anything that would take you out into a public space to use trails, you probably find that user groups across the board are growing faster than public trails can accommodate. And mountain bikers as a user group move a little quicker on trails and need like a little more real estate to do their activity than maybe other disciplines that are a little slower do. And that creates conflict. So Jason and I ran into that almost immediately. And because we grew up in a place where there is dedicated bike infrastructure, we thought, we were surprised it didn't exist in the volume we expected it to exist here. And we thought, because of our backgrounds and our experience with that type of infrastructure, we would be well suited to bring it to this area. So then it became kind of a mission to figure out, can it be done? And if you were going to do it, how would you do it? And I think there's a million things that go into that, but obviously land is the trickiest part. Like, where would you find land that's big enough and in an area where it makes sense? And I think that's really where we started our research. It wasn't so much let's go out into the woods and build mountain bike trails. It was like, how do you approach this from like in an organized way? And so we built essentially a business plan that said, if the right parcel existed and you could site this type of infrastructure on it, here's the value we think it could bring to a landowner. And that value is kind of in two parts. One is it gives a landowner the ability to provide stewardship and care of their property, because you're not building, if you've looked at our proposal or read about it at all, there's no hotel, there's no restaurant, there's no bar, there's no hospitality angle. This is just essentially an elevated version of what already exists in the area. Picture your Flying J's, your Meyer Ranches, your Staunton State Parks, but dedicated to a specific user group with like a higher level of chairs or of trails and that type of stuff. And so we essentially went and pitched it to, we thought that the public sector would be a good place to start, because you see how the ski resorts operate where, oftentimes it's public landowners, whether it's the federal government or state government, leasing land to recreational companies to provide that experience. And so we solicited a bunch of different organizations and we talked with a lot of different folks and we looked at a lot of different parcels. But the Colorado State Land Trust kind of kept coming back as one that made sense. One, because of the land holdings they have in the area where all the trail congestion is a problem, right? Like Conifer has a lot of it, but generally, Colorado's rural Front Range is where that issue is probably most prevalent, and that's where they have a lot of their land holdings. And then two, their mission is, there's a lot of public organizations that hold land, but a lot of them have kind of a conservation focus or something like that. And not that the land trust doesn't want to provide valuable stewardship of land, they do, but at their core, they're a revenue focused organization. So they're looking for opportunities where they can combine doing valuable things with their land, but also generating revenue to serve their mission, which is to benefit public education in the state of Colorado. And so that's why, from a relationship standpoint, the land trust made a lot of sense. And kind of our mission and their mission, we both felt like there was a lot of overlap. And then it came down to, what parcel would make the most sense. And we can get into it, the nitty gritty details if you want, but the parcel off of Shadow Mountain Drive makes a lot of sense, first of all, because of its proximity to other assets like it. So if we were to build a mountain bike park, which we've kind of talked about, is really just an elevated version of, we have a bunch of Jefferson County open spaces in the community, we have a Colorado State Park in the community. These are all places where people come and recreate during the day, whether it's on a bicycle or otherwise, and then they go home, and that's exactly what we're proposing here. So it's proximity to other things that are very similar, and its ability to serve the landowner's mission, provide valuable stewardship of land, and start to address the trail congestion problem, kind of made the Shadow Mountain property just stand out relative to other options, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it also came to the table when we started spending time in the conifer community that it made more sense. One, from the land perspective, like Phil was talking about, and topography and shape and everything like that, but the community we started to get engaged with and learned a lot and really started to feel at home and also see the opportunity of the benefits that we could bring to the specific town that we're siting this in. And that was a huge player in our decision-making process.
Where does it stand right now?
As of today, June 2nd, 2024, it is in the third referral process of the Jefferson County rezoning process. We're going through a special use permit, which is the same as the rezoning process, but it's on the current zoning of the property, so we're not changing the zoning. So what happens is you submit an application for development, relevant county departments review that application for sufficiency and look at the sciences and make sure it all looks good. And that's called a referral process, where they review that, they give you the results, and you have the opportunity to amend anything as needed. So we've gone through 3 rounds of that now, and we're just waiting for those responses to come back from the county. Once we get that response, that should tell us if we can go to hearings or if we need to do a little bit of extra work. But we're confident we'll be able to go to hearings. What those are, there's 2. There's one with the Jefferson County Planning and Zoning, where they do more of a sciences kind of evaluation and make sure you're not draining too much water or having too much traffic on the roadways, things like that. Once that occurs, about a month later will be a hearing with the 3 Jefferson County commissioners, who will decide on the approval of the project. Those are all public, and the public can make comments on those hearings as well, but we're confident we'll be able to get through that in the near future.
Yeah, that's really well said, and the value in the whole process, because it's long, right? And if you've been following the project, you've probably heard us say we're close for years. And the thing is, there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes with Jefferson County when you're working on something like this. But the value in it, in the length of the process for us as the applicant and for anybody out there in the community listening, is that there's a very robust group of people who evaluate land use decisions. And there's a lot of work involved in that on both sides. But the value is that when a project makes it to hearings, obviously there's still a decision to be made, but the research has been done, right? This isn't you draw out an idea on a napkin, you get a bunch of people in a room and we talk about it and decide. This is a lot of hard science and years of work that go into it on both sides, on the applicant side and on the county side, to make sure that once something gets to hearing, we have a lot of concrete things to discuss. So it's a long process, it's a complicated process. And we've worked through it as fast as we can as a small team. But ultimately we think that once the project gets to public hearings, that it will, at this point, it's in a place where all the research has been done and we can have a really substantive conversation about why it makes sense to move forward with it.
What are some of those things that have come out of all of that research? For example, traffic and wildfire and wildlife.
Yeah, that's a great question.
You know,
So
I'm kind of adding all three in. Take it one at a time, but those are three very important things to everyone in this community.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot of disciplines that go into this. I would say kind of the big four that we've probably spent the most time on with the county and discussing with the community, and the ones where you see the most questions coming from the community is probably traffic, wildfire risk, wildlife impact. EMS is kind of a subcategory of wildfire, and then natural resources, I think, is another one. And traffic's probably a good place to start. I think there's been a lot said about what our projected impact would be, and it's good to have probably the opportunity to just set the record straight on some things, so we're all operating, with the same baseline of information. So I don't know, Jason. People have said there's going to be 1,000 cars a day and things like that. What's the reality of it?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the truth of it all is that when we first came out with the idea and had our first community meeting, our numbers were significantly higher. We were expecting to have 1,000 cars bring in a ton of people. But through further research and feedback from the community, we realized that was too much. So from just a roadway being able to handle that level of traffic, it was an issue. An evacuation level, it's an issue. But also just from the park experience that we're trying to provide, it's an issue. We don't want to pack every rider in the state on this little mountain in Conifer, because then people will be riding all over each other and running over. So through the different renditions and versions of this project, as we've developed it through time with the county and with the community, we've rolled those numbers back to a number that we think is safe and sufficient and works for everybody. And that's actually at a 300 car parking lot, and that's managed by a reservation system. So there's a lot of comparisons and complaints to local trail networks like Cub Creek, Maxwell Falls, Buffalo Creek, all these trail networks that have a major parking issue where cars park along narrow roads and on dangerous shoulders, and it makes traffic even worse than just the cars driving normally. We're addressing that with the reservation system, which the other parks don't have. So if you don't have a reservation or aren't in a car with a reservation, you can't come to the park, or you'll be turned around if you happen to show up. So we've found that has worked well. As many Coloradans know, are skiers or go to the ski resorts. The reservation system kind of came up through COVID, and they have tested it out, and it works. So we're adopting that and using that to as a kind of first line measure to control the traffic flow on that road to keep it safe.
All right, Jason, that was great. Can you please tell us more about the reservation system?
Yeah, Phil, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to work pretty. If you were skiing in 2020, I think you'd probably have a pretty good idea how it works. But if you're not a skier, or you haven't engaged with a lot of the state or national parks that are doing this, or a really recent and relevant example is A Basin announced a month or two ago that they're going to reservation system going forward for all their seasons. So if anyone's out there concerned whether reservation systems work or not, they very much do. There's a lot of good examples of it. But in terms of kind of the nitty-gritty detail, essentially, so one of the nice things about our project is we're starting from scratch. So we're not dealing with legacy users who are used to engaging with us in one way and have to pivot to the new way of coming and enjoying the facility, right? We get to come from scratch as a new recreational asset and say, this is how it works at Shadow Mountain Bike Park. So our goal is to drive as many people as possible, ideally all of our visitors, to engage with us online before they ever show up to the park, right? So you're buying your ticket before you ever come and see us. And when you're going through that process, a parking reservation will be a part of the ticket you buy, right? So when you go online and you're just like, okay, I want to go ride at Shadow Mountain Bike Park tomorrow or next weekend or in 3 weekends or a month, whatever it is, right? It'll say, you know, as you're going through the checkout, here's your parking reservation number, please put in your license plate. Now, if you're buying a ticket day of or the day before, especially maybe on a weekend in the summer when we're going to be seeing more visitors, it's possible that we won't have a parking reservation available. So you'll get that notification when you're checking out, right? It'll say, hey, you can buy a ticket, we'd love to see you, but we're out of parking reservations for tomorrow or whatever day you're looking at coming. So just know that you'll have to be in a car with a parking reservation or you'll have to come on a different day, right? Or you will have the option to claim a parking reservation if somebody relinquishes one, right? So it's like, hey, we don't have any parking reservations available right now. Maybe you don't have a friend or someone else who's coming to the park that you could ride with. So it probably doesn't make sense for you to buy a ticket right now. Check back tomorrow afternoon and maybe there'll be a parking reservation available. And that kind of gets into like vehicle turnover, which I think is a big question for a lot of people. Like, okay, you say your parking lot's going to be 300 cars. It's actually 264 is the firm number, but call it 300 with staff parking and stuff. You know, how many of those vehicles are going to turn over? I think Jason, you know, did a really good job describing how the public open spaces and state parks work, where it's just come and go as you please, right? That's not how it works here. So because of the parking reservation system, vehicle turnover will be low relative to other assets, recreational assets you're probably familiar with. So it's not like it will never happen where somebody will ride for 4 or 5 hours and then leave and relinquish their parking reservation and somebody will claim it. But that will be a small group of vehicles relative to what you're probably experiencing in the public open spaces.
It's also something that we can control. Like,
Yeah.
If we're seeing an issue with that, we can turn that feature off.
Exactly.
So there's ways with the technology and the vendors that we're working with to make this all as safe and efficient as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a lot of other downstream benefits to the parking reservation system, and I think, you know, Jason put it so well. Like we realized early on when we kind of released the idea of the concept that it was going to be popular. And at that point we were like, okay, we need to do things to control the volume of visitors for the community's sake and for our sake as a business, right? We don't want an experience that is poor. And crowded trails and all that type of stuff leads to poor visitor experience. So at first we actually thought about capping ticket sales as a way to manage visitation, but then we realized that that doesn't necessarily control the parking and the traffic issue. So instead we decided, let's control parking, and by controlling parking we mitigate traffic and we can control visitation at the same time. So there's a lot of downstream benefits to it outside of just keeping the amount of cars down. It also does things like mitigate conflicts with other people using the roadway, right? So let's say you live in the area where the park's being proposed and you're like, well, I go to work in the morning, or my kids take school buses, or whatever that potential conflict with our visitors could be. The nice thing about the reservation system is it mitigates, almost removes the incentive for our visitors to show up early, right? So our operating hours are roughly 9:30 or 10 in the morning until the evening. So if you know you're coming to the park and you have a parking reservation, right? And this isn't a massive parking lot where you have to walk half a mile to get, like, it's right in front of the lodge. It's a small parking lot. There's no incentive to show up at 6:30 in the morning and sit there and wait, right? Because you know you have a place to park. So other than our staff coming to get the park ready in the morning, you're not really going to be sharing the roadway with our visitors because there's no incentive for them to get there early, if that makes sense. So that kind of controls potential conflicts in the morning. Also, the flow of traffic does that to a degree, right? Because if you're going to work or going to school, you're leaving the area where our visitors are coming, or our employees. And at the end of the day, same thing. Even if you were coming home from work in the evening, like 6:30 at night or whatever that is, our visitors, those that are left at the park, would be going kind of the other way. So the parking reservation system controls visitation, so it keeps the number of people at the park down. It mitigates the amount of cars on the roadway, and at the same time, it keeps people kind of operating at hours that should largely not be in conflict, which is nice. And then obviously, there's talk of what if it's snowing or raining or the road is, in a condition where people shouldn't be driving on it? Well, there's a correlation between when you shouldn't be driving on a road and when you shouldn't be riding a mountain bike, right? So we're not going to have the park open when we have unseasonable weather, right? So if it's, sometimes it snows on June 1st, right? The park would be closed. So
I would imagine that would raise your liability risk. Should you let people go riding down a muddy path that's slippery that they can fall and break their arm?
Right. Yeah, so we have the ability to control when we're open and when visitors can come.
And you would just refund them for a different day if they end up they already had paid for that day and it had to close that day because of unforeseen weather.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you would get a refund or be able to repurpose your ticket and parking reservation a different day.
Okay.
Yeah. But similar lines to that with the mountain roads and weather and conditions and things like that. A lot of people say like the people gonna come up here don't know mountain roads, they don't know Shadow Mountain Drive, but by nature of our visitors being mountain bikers, they do know mountain roads. They do have the types of vehicles that do work well on these types of roads. And again, we're not going to be riding during the snow, but generally speaking, they're going to the mountains to find their riding spots. So they know how to adapt to the roadways very well. And typically aren't really going very fast when they have thousands of dollars worth of gear on the back. So that should largely be mitigated or just not necessarily as much of an issue as it's perceived to be just, innately.
Yeah. No, that's very true. I mean, the nature of the sport, and if people are concerned about reckless driving, the nature of the sport and the amount of money that people are spending on it and the items they're carrying with them do largely mitigate their speed. But people may point out that, Jefferson County sheriffs have said that the majority of people driving on Shadow Mountain Drive are speeding. And that is true. Jason and I actually participated in a forum last year with the community and with some staff from Jefferson County Planning and Zoning that have a traffic focus. And there was a Jefferson County sheriff's officer on that call. I'm struggling to remember his last name, but and that was brought up and discussed. And what's interesting about that is it is true that there's a lot of speeding, not just on Shadow Mountain Drive, but on roads in the Conifer area in general. But the folks that are generally the offenders are local. And that's not a knock on people who live locally. It's just if you're familiar with the road, you're more likely to maybe exceed the speed limit, right? So it's not actually very often that Jefferson County sheriffs are stopping somebody who's not familiar with the area for speeding. It's usually the local folks. But beyond that, whether it's people who live locally or visitors coming to the park or anybody who's sharing the roadways in the community, we can go beyond and we can put up signs and we can do things to try to inform people, hey, this is an area where you're going to want to watch your speed. And we can do that as people leave the park. We can do it with intersections where it makes sense as people are coming to visit us. And there's a lot of things we can do beyond just the parking reservation system and whatever to educate people, not just for our visitors, but for anybody who's driving in the area and sharing the roads.
Yeah, it might not be a popular opinion amongst people who don't think this is a good idea, but safety is a major concern of ours on the roadways and the mountain, in all aspects of the word safety. That includes fire and traffic and wildlife and everything. That's kind of all encompassing, but that is a major focus. And bringing it back to what I said earlier, when we had thousands of cars in our projected business plan, we realized that that wasn't a very safe number to operate with. So we brought that down to a much more safe, reasonable, operable number on the roadway.
Absolutely. And that kind of bleeds into, there's probably more things, there's a million things we could talk about traffic related, and we can get back to it if it makes sense, but maybe it's a nice segue into some of the forest fire conversations. Realistically, what type of risk could this facility present to the public in terms of forest fire, because that's obviously a key issue up here. And evacuation scenarios are a big one, right? And that's kind of a blend of forest fire safety and traffic. And I think we heard recently that we don't have an evacuation plan, which is not true. If you look at our application, we very much do, and there have been different iterations of it. So most recently, we pivoted from, I think the simplest way to describe it would be shelter in place. We pivoted to having our visitors actually evacuate in the event of a forest fire, and we'll get into the reasons why we did that. But one thing to point out is that when we're talking about potential situations where our visitors are evacuating because of a forest fire in the area at the same time as local residents, that assumes the park is open. Right, so that's really, you're describing a scenario where a forest fire starts during the day while the park is open. Obviously, for the same reasons we wouldn't have the park open if it was forecasted to snow, we wouldn't have the park open if there was any chance a forest fire could encroach and put our visitors at risk, right? So if the afternoon before or the evening before or early in the morning of a day that we're supposed to operate, there's news, and we would obviously be pretty plugged in too, because it's a huge risk to our business and our visitors and the community. We wouldn't be open, right? So if there was any chance a forest fire could come anywhere near the park, we would obviously be closed that day. Now, if a scenario arises where the park is open and a forest fire starts in the area and it's threatening people who live locally and threatening our park and that type of stuff, initially we had it modeled where our visitors would shelter in place, right? So we would give a window of time where everybody stays put at the park, giving local residents the opportunity to evacuate out, and then our visitors would evacuate after that. And we submitted that. We used a company called Ember Alliance, who is, if you do a little bit of research on them, they're pretty reputable in the state when it comes to these type of things. We designed that whole evacuation plan with them. We submitted it to Jefferson County. Some feedback came back from the county. We were obviously in tandem talking with Elk Creek and other stakeholders in the EMS and wildfire space locally at the same time. And based on the feedback that came in, we pivoted to having our visitors evacuate. And we'll get into how that will work. But we did that because Shadow Mountain Drive, and Shadow Mountain Drive is not unique in this. A lot of the roadways in this area, whether the property you're evacuating from is safe from a forest fire standpoint or not, the roadway you're evacuating on might not be, right? Meaning that there could be a lot of fuel on either side of the road, right? So even if your property, right, is perfectly mitigated for forest fire, while you're trying to drive out, you could run into sections of roadway that are not, and that could halt your evacuation. So we pivoted from just mitigating our property and having our visitors shelter in place to mitigating our property, also mitigating Shadow Mountain Drive from where our egress is all the way down to essentially where 73, where you'd be getting on 285. So we mitigate the entire roadway, make the roadway safer to evacuate, because there were concerns about whether we shelter in place or not. Anybody could have a problem getting out. And then having our visitors evacuate immediately. And part of the reason for that is when you think about like the actual mechanics of how people prepare to evacuate in a forest fire, some homeowners are more prepared to evacuate than others, but it's usually not I get a text or a push notification, there's a forest fire in the area and I blow out my front door, right? You got to button up a few things, whether it's grab something out of the safe or where's the kids, this or that, where's the dogs, this and that, whatever, right? It's a few minutes before you're probably in the car and actually leaving your driveway. Where at our park, the park's closed, nobody has any personal items of value here, right? The park's closed, our staff is on it, load your bike, get out. So while there may be a few residents who are that quick, our visitors should be able to evacuate the area before most homeowners are out of their house, packed up, ready to go and gone. And so mitigating the roadway to make it safer for everybody, and having evacuation procedures in place at the park that make our visitors able to shut the park down and get people out, from a scientific perspective, is actually safer for everybody than if we just did a big shelter in place and all of that. So that's kind of why we made that switch. And it is a lot to go into our application and read all this, because it's like thousands of pages, and we're not shocked that not everyone's up to speed on all of this, but that's kind of the a little bit of a deep dive on how we're planning to manage evacuation and why we kind of made that pivot.
And that's something that isn't just a set in stone final plan either. We're going to
Yeah.
constantly be reviewing this and developing this with Jefferson County, with the Elk Creek fire system, and any other potential beneficial players or departments that can just make that as safe as possible for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And there's 2 ways to exit the property on the main road, correct? You can either go straight down Shadow Mountain onto 73 or up and around Brook Forest, right?
Yeah, I mean, the reality of where our visitors will be coming from, most of them will be evacuating down Shadow Mountain Drive and hitting Highway 73 and then either heading towards Evergreen or heading towards 285. Which from an evacuation standpoint, obviously the further you go up Brook Forest, the kind of the windier it gets.
True.
So while there will be some people evacuating that way, it would be a small portion of our visitors based
It
on.
depends on the wildfire, which way it's
Yeah,
going.
it depends
Yeah.
on the situation
Sure,
of the
that's true,
fire
too.
itself, and we can determine that as the situation arises. And again, that's further plans that we'll be able to develop with the county and relevant departments.
How long is your longest route that you would expect it would take someone X minutes to get down the hill that you could inform them there's an issue and they need to evacuate?
Well, the nice thing about this,
Or how could you reach
Yeah.
everyone on the trails?
it's a great question. I mean, the simplest answer is this is not a large mountain. It's actually a hill by definition. It's under 1,969 feet, which I think is the.
Oh, so you grew up in Ohio like I did, and where we call them mountains, they're really
Sure.
hills.
Yeah, so it's about 800 vertical feet that we're working with, right? So this isn't like a ski resort where people are spread out, thousands and thousands of acres. So you essentially, the time to get from the top to the bottom is a matter of minutes if you're riding. And then obviously we have staff at the top of the mountain to communicate with people that, the chairlift is closed. We're getting everyone who's still on the chairlift off, ride down and follow evacuation. So realistically I just got off the chairlift, I've been notified that the park is closing because of, it could be any emergency, right? It doesn't have to be a forest fire, it could be anything. Forest fire is probably the most likely, but you're talking a matter of minutes, right, before they're being ushered to the parking lot, put your stuff on your car and go. So from a fire suppression standpoint, Jefferson County is very rigorous. And they're retrofitting a lot of stuff, and if you own a home in the area or a commercial building in the area, you're probably experiencing that. If you're trying to do like an addition or something, you're probably surprised by how many sprinklers you have to have and things like that. But if you're doing a new build, which is what we would be doing, you have to be able to suppress a fire, whether it's started inside your building or there's a forest fire threatening it, whatever, to a degree that is extremely robust. So on our property, and I'd have to get out the actual drawing, so I'm gonna roughly estimate it right now, but it's over 100,000 gallons of water that will be stored on our property just for suppressing fire. And that's water that could be used for us in the event that there's something going on at the park or, a forest fire in the area. But it's also water that could be used by Elk Creek or anybody else, right? You could conceivably come to the park and there'd be a lot of water stored there that could fill up a fire truck or whatever, and actually go suppress fires in the area in general, whether it's a home fire or otherwise, which is a value to the community, whether it's in the event that we're using it or it's in the event that it get used for something else.
There's a lot of talk out there, and though it's true that 84% of forest fires are started by humans, if you actually look at the context of what makes up that number and how those fires are started, we don't actually have any of those sources of forest fires at our park. So we don't have like large machinery or campfires or burn barrels or you can look at the list, you can just Google it really quick. And mountain bikers themselves, though they are people, are not inherently starting forest fires. Even if you're thinking that they might be smoking or something like that. They're really not. If they were starting forest fires, you would be seeing a lot more fires on public trail networks or anywhere in Colorado. There's 10,000 miles of trails in Colorado. Mountain bikers are not starting forest fires on them. Ski resorts like Winter Park that does downhill mountain biking, they would not be allowing skiers on their mountain if they were burning down all of their assets and real estate and everything. So
Or mountain bikers on their mountain.
yeah, or other mountain bikers. So that's an important thing to consider, is the context of those numbers that are being thrown out there, and what we're doing to mitigate what risk there is. So even just the mountain and the people that will be visiting, we're going to be mitigating the entire acreage of the property, because it's in a very unhealthy state today. And for our benefit and the benefit of the whole community, we're going to be mitigating over 300 acres of unhealthy forest. So we want to bring that well away from that state to a really healthy state where it's not a forest fire risk from just a general fire. Maybe it's lightning or something else, but human generated as well. So that's kind of like a first level, like something that we can do that greatly increases the safety of the property. But also, unlike other public trail networks where mountain bikers are riding, we're going to have staff on site, much more staff than any park can do with rangers, on site, making sure people are behaving, reacting to any situations that arise, and preventing, bad things from happening.
Yeah, and Jason's point is a really good one about our ability to manage at a much higher level. And we're in no way knocking the efforts that are made on public trail networks to manage visitors. But when you look at the staff to visitor ratio, Staunton's a great example, right? You have 300,000 people, probably more. That's just the people that they count coming in and out of the park during the hours where, because it's a 24-hour park, right? The ranger or volunteer to visitor ratio is way higher than what you'd be looking at our park, right? We're going to have a fraction of the visitors that Staunton has, with a staff that, when it comes to like visitor to staff ratio, is much higher. And so that gives us the ability to just manage visitation at a much higher level. And to Jason's point, you look at all these public trail networks that we're all familiar with and enjoy, and while there are rangers out there and volunteers out there, these parks are, I don't want to call them unmanaged, but I've been to Staunton or Flying J or Meyer Ranch or whatever a million times, and there's plenty of times where you go out and come back and never see a ranger or a volunteer, right? You're managing your own behavior. Where at our park, you're interacting with a staff member, or a staff member has eyes on our visitors from the second you drive in to when you go into our visitor center to, show that you have a ticket or rent a bike or whatever you're doing, to when you get on the chairlift, when you get off the chairlift, we'll have staff on the trails, right? So this is just our ability to interact with and manage our visitors it's just higher than what you see on public trail networks. And again, to Jason's point, even in these scenarios where there's hundreds of thousands of mountain bikers riding in this community, they're not starting forest fires. So you introduce our ability to manage with the historical behavior of our user group, which is mountain bikers, and you can come to it's a pretty reasonable conclusion that this is not inherently a forest fire risk to the community. It should be the opposite. It should be an asset, because we're mitigating an unhealthy property, we're managing visitors at a higher level, and everybody should be safer because of that.
And I think that segues into the safety aspect. And how many riders do you expect to get injured while they're there at the park, riding for the day, going downhill really fast, and how will you deal with that?
That's a great question. So it's tough to estimate an exact number for you, what we expect from an injury perspective. But there, again, context comes into play here. So we are going to design the trails specifically for mountain biking, with things considered in the trail design that you can't do on public trails for various reasons. So our trails will be designed in a safer way just from the beginning for riders. Then you don't have other user groups interacting on that same trail causing issues. So it's one direction, one user group, just going having fun in a well-designed trail network. So that alone should help to reduce natural injuries that do happen on other public trail networks. Now, not saying that injuries won't happen, because they will, but if they do happen, we will have staff on site, similar to what you see at a ski resort, where they are handling at least the initial triage and extrication off the mountain, and maybe treating minor injuries just at the base. So we will be doing that with our own staff. We'll take care of the issue on the mountain, out in the trail, get them off, and if there is transport needed where they can't have a family member or friend take them to the hospital and we need an emergency vehicle, then we will have them ready for transport. So it's just a pick up and drop them off at the hospital. It's not like it is today on other trail networks where it's multiple staff members from the local EMS system gathering up all their gear, going to a trailhead, hiking all their gear in for miles and trying to find somebody, then assessing the situation, then packaging them up, then carrying them out of that trail network. Then you get the transport, right? That's 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, who knows how far in that injured person is. Where we're able to get them off in a matter of minutes because we've got the gear and the staff ready to get them off the mountain. If that transport is needed, it's a much shorter time where that asset is out of service.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there are, we're not doing this in a vacuum, right? We're having conversations with other recreational facilities that offer similar experiences and looking at what are they dealing with and how could that impact. And we've actually, we've had conversations with probably the most relevant example in the country, which is called Highland Mountain Bike Park, and it's in a very small town in New Hampshire, not unsimilar to Conifer, which is where Jason and I grew up. And we do have data about what percentage of their visitors need to be transported, and it's
I forget off the top of my head, but it's
less than a 12th of a percent.
It was less. It was about 0.12%, I believe,
of annual visitors need to be transported. So, when you look at your annual visitation, the number of folks that need that service is a very, very, very small percentage. And to Jason's point, right, we're only relying on local resources for the transportation. And then I think there's still going to be questions, and they're fair questions, right, about, okay, even if it's only transport, there's still a cost associated with that. How do you guys work to offset that? How do you work with local EMS resources to augment whatever impact's going to be? And we've heard claims that we're not going to be paying taxes, or there's no revenue that would go to that, or we're not opening to partnering with those recent, whatever it is, and that is all just not true.
At the least, it's very misleading. So by nature, the state land board themselves, as our landowner, does not pay taxes because they are a state agency. However, the government knows how to tax you, right? Death and taxes. And there's something called a possessory interest tax, which is how the government taxes businesses that operate on exempt lands. And that's something that the county will assess at the time of our opening and creation, where they assess the values of the properties and the improvements that we made and the lease payments that we've negotiated with the land trust. And that is a significant amount of taxes that we're estimating that we'll be paying annually, in the tunes of our growth pattern upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. We're paying a significant amount of taxes, even though this landowner is tax exempt. Yeah, you may not see it directly written in the application, the dedication to safety that we have, because there's still a lot of science that needs to happen in that application that we need to focus on. but safety is a huge part of our decision-making process and design of this park. Some of that is reflected in the application that you can find publicly, but there's only a fraction of what we can do down the road that is going to actually reflect in that application. You know, once we start actually designing facilities and developing the plans further and see things come to fruition, can we make better and more concrete plans around safety, no matter what, you know, subset of safety that actually is. And you know, we love this community. We've come to love it. It's very similar to where we grew up, and we want to be part of it, and we want the community to be safe and feel safe as well. We don't want to come in and just have everybody just feel like they're being attacked. We love it here.
Could you cite this somewhere else conceivably? Yes. You know, finding the right parcel is very challenging. We did look in Idaho Springs. We never had a formal conversation with Echo Mountain, but that's just because the property itself is not a fit for what we're trying to do for a variety of reasons. But beyond all of that, we're trying to address the problem where it exists, right? And anybody who's using public trails in this area either isn't using them enough, so they're not experiencing the trail congestion, or they're not being forthcoming if they say, I don't experience trail congestion. Like, if you're an active user of recreational assets in this community, I don't think you could deny that the community needs more trails. And not only more trails, but dedicated infrastructure for specific user groups. Mm-hmm. And so beyond all of the kind of mechanical reasons why this property is a fit, we're citing it in the area where the problem exists. And we're citing it close to other recreational assets, like Flying J is next door. Staunton is less than a linear mile away. Meyer Ranch is down the street. Maxwell Falls is effectively down the street. This is not some weird thing being put somewhere where no one's ever seen anything like it. It's a dedicated space for a specific user group, but that user group is already using all of these other assets that are essentially next door.